Billionaire invited his childless ex-wife for Easter to humiliate her. But she showed up with triplets. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, resting among bills and ordinary letters that didn't ask anything of her. This one did. Adela noticed it before she even reached for it. It wasn't trying to blend in. Cream-colored, thick, carefully sealed, not friendly, not casual, deliberate. She stood there a moment longer than necessary, keys still in her hand, as if picking it up might reopen something she had already closed. Of course, she murmured under her breath, because there was only one person who sent things like this, and only one reason he would. She turned it over slowly, her thumb brushing across the edge, not just in weight, but in intention. Her name was written across the front in careful lettering, Adela Harbor, not rushed, not casual, deliberate. She let out a soft breath, almost amused. "You always did like presentation," she said quietly, as if he could hear her from wherever he was. The seal came apart cleanly. Inside, the card waited. Gold lettering, perfect spacing, no room for misinterpretation. "You are cordially invited to the Russell Easter brunch." Her eyes didn't linger there. They moved lower, straight to the line that mattered. "It's time we caught up. Emmett Russell." Adela held the card still, her expression unreadable. Then, just slightly, she smiled. "Caught up," she repeated softly. Not confused, not surprised. She understood exactly what that meant. It wasn't about conversation, it wasn't about closure, and it definitely wasn't about kindness. 3 years. That's how long it had been since she last heard his name spoken directly to her. 3 years since she walked away without turning back. And now, this. "No," she said quietly, shaking her head once, not in refusal, in recognition. Adela leaned back against the counter, arms folding loosely as she looked at the invitation again. Easter brunch, public, polished, carefully timed. He hadn't chosen a quiet place. He hadn't reached out privately. He chose a room full of people, a setting where everything could be seen and measured. Her lips curved slightly. "Still the same," she said under her breath, because Emmett never did anything without purpose, and whatever this was, it wasn't about reconnecting. She didn't need a picture to remember him. He was already there, standing in a bookstore, years ago, looking nothing like the man people knew now. Less guarded, less calculated. "Careful," his voice had said from behind her, warm with quiet amusement. "That looks like a fall waiting to happen." Adela had turned, one brow lifting. "Or," she replied, steady and unimpressed, "you could just hand it to me." He smiled then, not the kind of smile practiced in meetings. Something easier, real. And he reached past her, taking the book from the shelf and placing it in her hands. "Fair point," he said. That was him, or at least, that was who he used to be. Adela picked up the invitation again, holding it lightly between her fingers. Funny how something so small could carry so much weight. She didn't feel angry. That had passed a long time ago. And she didn't feel hurt, not in the way people would expect. What she felt instead was something quieter, clarity, the kind that only comes after you've already let something go. Still, her gaze lingered on his name, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like when that name meant something different. She walked over to the window, the invitation still in her hand. Outside, the day moved forward like nothing had changed, people passing, cars slowing at the corner, life continuing. But her thoughts stayed with one question. Why now? Not asked in confusion, asked with awareness, because timing was never random with him. Not then, not now. Something about this invitation had been chosen carefully. The date, the setting, the audience, which meant there was something he expected from this. And the only question left was, what? Have you ever been invited somewhere you already knew wouldn't feel right? Not because of the place, but because of the history waiting for you there? Because sometimes the hardest invitations aren't the ones you hesitate to accept. They're the ones you understand too well. Adela didn't need to guess what kind of room this would be. She could already hear it. The polite conversations, the quiet judgments, the questions that sound kind, but aren't. And at the center of it, him, watching, waiting. She set the invitation down gently, her decision not spoken, but already made. And if you've ever faced a moment like that, where the past shows up uninvited, dressed like an opportunity, then you already know. Some stories don't begin with excitement, they begin with a choice. So before we go any further, if you enjoy stories that feel a little closer to real life, take a second to subscribe, because this one It doesn't go where you think it will. Adela glanced at the clock, then back at the card. All right, she said quietly. Not to anyone, just to herself, and this time, she picked it up without hesitation. It was a narrow aisle, the kind that made you turn slightly sideways when someone else walked through, offering a quiet apology even if neither of you was really in the way. Adela stood on the tips of her shoes, fingers stretching toward a book just out of reach. She almost had it. Almost. Careful, a voice said behind her, calm, lightly amused. That's not worth falling for. She froze for a second, not startled, just aware. Then she lowered her arm slowly and turned. He was standing close enough to help, but far enough not to assume. Well, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, then you should probably hand it to me. There was no hesitation. He reached up, took the book down with ease, and held it out to her. No argument there. She accepted it, glancing briefly at the cover before looking back at him. Thank you. Any time, he replied. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Not awkward, just paused, as if something small had already started. They saw each other again a week later, not planned, not arranged, just coincidence that didn't feel accidental. You again, Adela said, a faint smile pulling at her lips. Emmett leaned lightly against the counter, holding a cup of coffee. I was about to say the same thing. Do you always stand in the exact same spot? She asked. Only when I'm hoping to run into someone interesting. She let out a soft laugh. That sounds practiced. It's not, he said, then paused. Okay, maybe a little. That was how it went. Easy, no pressure to impress, no need to fill every silence. Conversations drifted instead of being forced. They talked about books they didn't finish, places they wanted to visit, and things that didn't seem important at the time, but somehow were, and somewhere in between, they stopped being strangers. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where everything suddenly became serious. Instead, it grew in small ways. He learned how she took her coffee. No sugar, just a little cream. She learned he always checked the time twice before leaving anywhere. He started saving her a seat without asking. She started texting him when she got home, not because she had to, but because it felt natural. Did you finish that book yet? He asked once, glancing at her over the top of his cup. Adela shook her head. No, I got distracted. By what? She met his eyes, a quiet smile forming. You. He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze a second longer than usual. Then, that's a good distraction. It wasn't the big moments that brought them closer. It was everything in between. The way he reached for her hand without thinking, and she didn't pull away. The way she leaned into him slightly when they walked, like she trusted he would always be there. The way conversations didn't need effort. One evening, they sat across from each other at a small table, the kind that wobbled slightly if you weren't careful. You're quiet tonight, he said. Adela traced the rim of her glass with her finger. Just thinking, about? She hesitated, then looked up at him. This feels easy. He smiled, not surprised. That's because it is. And for once, she believed someone when they said that. The apartment wasn't impressive. It wasn't meant to be. Boxes lined the walls, half opened, some untouched. The couch had been delivered that morning, still carrying the faint scent of something new and unfamiliar. Adela sat cross-legged on the floor, holding a plate balanced carefully on her lap. This might be the worst dinner we've had, she said, eyeing the takeout container. Emmett leaned back against the wall, one arm resting behind him. It's definitely not our finest moment, she smiled. And yet, he finished, glancing around the room. It still feels right. They didn't rush to fix everything, didn't try to make it perfect. They let it be unfinished, because somehow, that made it feel more real. Later that night, the room had grown quieter. The city outside softened into a distant hum, barely noticeable. Emmett shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers as he leaned his head back against the wall. You ever think about what this turns into? He asked. Adela tilted her head. What do you mean? He gestured vaguely around them. This, us, all of it. She considered it for a moment. Sometimes, and... She looked at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. I don't want something that just looks good, she said. I want something that actually lasts. He nodded slowly. Yeah. A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Then he turned slightly toward her. Let's build something that matters. She studied him for a second, as if weighing the words. Something real? she asked. Something real. And this time, there was no doubt in either of their voices. At the time, nothing felt uncertain. There were no warning signs loud enough to notice, just small moments that didn't seem important. A delayed reply here, a rescheduled plan there, things that could easily be explained, and were. Sorry, I got caught up, Emmett said once, loosening his tie as he walked through the door. Adela glanced at the clock, then back at him. It's okay, and she meant it, because back then, it always was. She didn't question it, didn't look for meaning where there didn't seem to be any. You don't expect it to change. Days turned into weeks, weeks into something more settled. They found a rhythm without trying. Morning coffee before either of them fully woke up. Short messages during the day that didn't need long replies. Evenings that didn't require plans to feel complete. You're getting used to me, he said once, watching her move easily through the kitchen. Adela glanced over her shoulder. I think I already am. That was fast. She shrugged slightly. Some things don't take long. He smiled, stepping closer. Is that a good thing? She met his eyes. It is when it feels right, and it did. Looking back, it wasn't one moment that made her believe in him. It was all of them. The ordinary ones, the quiet ones, the ones no one else would notice, because that's where everything real lived, not in grand gestures, not in perfect timing, but in the way he reached for her without thinking, the way she trusted him without needing proof, and the way, for a while, nothing felt uncertain. Adela blinked, the memory fading just enough to bring her back to the present. The invitation still sat where she left it, unmoved, unchanged, but now it felt different in her hands, because she remembered exactly who he used to be, and that made one thing clear. Whatever waited for her at that Easter brunch wasn't that man. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment where everything changed, no announcement, no clear line between before and after, just small shifts that felt temporary at first. Emmett started staying later at work. Not dramatically later, just enough to notice I might be a little late tonight, he said one evening, already reaching for his jacket. Adela looked up from the couch. How late is a little late? He paused, thinking. Not too bad. She smiled faintly. Okay, and at the time, that was enough. At first, she adjusted without thinking. Dinner moved an hour later, then 2. Sometimes it didn't happen at all. The messages changed too. Shorter, less, present, running behind, meeting went long, we'll talk later. And she believed it. Not because she had to, but because there was no reason not to. One night she glanced at her phone again, the screen lighting up her face in the dim room. No new messages. She set it down slowly, then picked it up again. Still nothing. It's fine, she said quietly to herself, and it was, at least. That's what she told herself. She didn't push, didn't question, didn't demand explanations, because she understood what it meant to build something, and she believed in what they were building. So she made room for it. You don't have to rush home, she told him once over the phone, her voice steady. I'll still be here. There was a pause on the other end. I know, he said, and something about the way he said it felt different, not wrong, just distant. They still talked, just not the way they used to. Conversations became updates, not exchanges. How was your day? She asked one evening as he walked in. Busy, he replied, loosening his tie. What about yours? Quiet. He nodded. Good. That was it. No follow-up, no curiosity, just enough words to fill the space. Adela watched him for a second longer than usual, as if waiting for something more. It didn't come. It wasn't the big things that changed. It was the small ones, the ones that used to mean something. Dinner at the table turned into dinner alone. Conversations turned into silence shared in the same room. One night, she set 2 plates out without thinking, then stopped, looked at the second one, and slowly put it back. When he came home later, she was already cleaning up. You ate? He asked. She nodded. Yeah. A brief pause. I waited a little. He looked at her, but not long enough to respond. Sorry, he said, already moving past her. And somehow, that word didn't carry what it used to. The apartment didn't feel the same. It looked the same. Nothing had changed physically. But something was missing. The quiet used to feel comfortable. Now, it felt noticeable. They sat side by side one evening, the television playing something neither of them was really watching. Adela glanced at him. You remember when we used to talk about everything? She asked softly. Emmett kept his eyes forward. We still do. She didn't respond right away, just watched him. Then, "Not like this." He didn't answer. And that silence said more than anything else. Adela wasn't unaware. She saw it, felt it, recognized it. But she didn't name it, not yet, because once you say something out loud, it becomes real, and she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she held on to what she could. The routines, the familiarity, the idea that this was just a phase, that things would settle, that they would find their way back. Because they always had. It became clearer over time, not through words, but through choices. Work came first, always, not because he said it, because he showed it. Calls interrupted dinners. Plans were adjusted around meetings. Time together became something that had to be scheduled, not something that just happened. "You've been really busy lately," Adela said one evening, keeping her tone light. Emmett nodded, focused on something on his phone. "Yeah, it's a lot right now." She hesitated. "Do you think it'll slow down?" He didn't look up. "Not anytime soon." A small pause settled between them. Then she nodded. "Okay." And just like that, something shifted again. It wasn't one moment. It wasn't one conversation. It was a series of small realizations that slowly became impossible to ignore. Adela stood by the window one night, watching the city move in the distance. Lights turning on and off, people going somewhere, coming back from somewhere, living. Behind her, the apartment felt still, quiet in a way that didn't feel shared anymore. She crossed her arms lightly, her thoughts steady. Because somewhere beneath all of this, there was something else. Something they hadn't fully faced yet. Something that couldn't be ignored much longer. And when it finally came to the surface, it wouldn't be quiet. The distance between them hadn't happened all at once, which made it harder to fix. Because by the time you noticed it clearly, it was already there. And soon, what they hadn't been saying would finally be said. It didn't begin as an argument. It never did. The conversation started the way most difficult ones do, gently, almost carefully. They were sitting across from each other, dinner untouched between them. Adela had been quiet for most of the evening, her thoughts circling something she could no longer set aside. "Emmett," she said finally. He looked up, just briefly. "Yeah?" She hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew what it might lead to. "We've been avoiding something." His expression didn't change much. "We've been busy." She held his gaze. "That's not the same thing." A small pause. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "What do you want to talk about?" She didn't rush, didn't soften it. "Us," she said. And just like that, the room felt different. It had started months before this moment. Quiet appointments, careful conversations, rooms that always felt too still. The doctor's voice had been calm, measured, kind in the way people try to be when delivering something difficult. "There are options," she had said. "There's still time." Adela had nodded, listening closely, asking questions, holding on to possibility. But beside her, Emmett had been quieter, not distant, just less engaged. "Do you understand everything?" the doctor asked. Adela nodded. "Yes." Emmett gave a short nod as well. "Yeah." But his tone didn't carry the same weight. And she noticed, even then, she noticed. At first they approached it together. Or at least, it looked that way. They followed the steps, kept the appointments, had the conversations. But something changed over time. Not dramatically, just in the way effort started to feel one-sided. "I can schedule another consultation," Adela said one evening, standing near the kitchen counter. Emmett glanced up briefly. "Another one?" "Yes." "For what?" She blinked slightly. "For us." A small pause. He looked back down at his phone. "Adela, we've already talked about this." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. "Have we?" It wasn't that he didn't care. At least, that's what she told herself at first. But his focus shifted, less about possibility, more about outcome. "We've been trying for years," he said one night, his tone steady, almost detached. Adela sat across from him, her hands resting in her lap. "I know." He nodded once. "I just think we need to be realistic." She held his gaze. "What does that mean?" Another pause, then, "It means we should start thinking about what's next." The words weren't harsh, but they weren't gentle either. They were final. After that, something changed, not loudly, not visibly, but clearly. The conversations stopped being shared. They became separate thoughts spoken into the same space. "I'm not ready to give up," Adela said one evening, her voice calm but firm. Emmett didn't look at her. "I didn't say you had to. That's what it sounds like." He exhaled, leaning back. "I'm saying we need to be practical." She looked at him carefully. "And I'm saying we're not done." Their eyes met, and for the first time, they weren't on the same side. The night everything settled into place. There was nothing unusual about it. Same tables, same chairs, same quiet space between them. But this time, neither of them avoided it. Emmett set his fork down, his expression unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," he said. Adela didn't move. "Doing what?" "This," he repeated, gesturing slightly between them, waiting, hoping, not knowing. Her voice stayed steady. "That's part of it." He shook his head once. "Not for me." Silence stretched across the table, heavy, but controlled. He looked at her then, really looked. "We've been trying for years." She nodded slowly. "I know." His next words came without hesitation. "I have to think about the future." And there it was, not loud, not emotional, but undeniable. Adela felt the shift immediately, not in what he said, but in what he meant. Her voice was quiet when she answered. "I thought we were the future." He didn't respond, didn't correct her, didn't reassure her, and that was the answer. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask him to explain further, because she already understood. Adela leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands folding loosely in her lap. "So that's it?" she asked. Emmett hesitated. "I don't know what else to do." She studied him for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just clarity. "You could stay," she said. The words were simple, but they carried everything. He looked at her, something shifting behind his expression. But it didn't last. "I don't think staying changes anything." And just like that, it was over. If you've ever sat across from someone you love and realize they've already made a decision without you, then you understand this moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet enough to hurt more than it should. And if you've ever had to choose between holding on or letting go, comment "I understand" below, because some choices don't feel like choices at all. After that, there wasn't much left to say. They sat there for a while longer, not arguing, not resolving anything, just existing in the space between what was and what wasn't anymore. Emmett eventually stood, adjusting his jacket slightly. "I think we both need time," he said. Adela didn't respond, not because she disagreed, but because time wouldn't change what had already happened. She watched him walk away, not stopping him, not calling his name, because for the first time, she knew she didn't need to. She didn't leave that night, not physically, but something in her did, something quiet, something certain, because love, even real love, doesn't survive where it isn't held. And when she finally walked away, it wouldn't be out of anger. It would be because she understood something he didn't. The days after that dinner didn't explode into chaos. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just space, the kind that settles in slowly until it becomes impossible to ignore. Emmett moved through the apartment like everything was still the same. Phone calls, meetings, short replies, routine. Adela moved differently, not distant, not cold, just clear. She didn't bring the conversation up again, didn't ask him to reconsider, because she already knew. He had made his decision, and now she was making hers. It wasn't immediate. She didn't wake up the next morning ready to leave. Instead, she gave herself time to sit with it, to feel it fully, without rushing to fix it. She stood in the kitchen one morning, staring at her reflection in the window as the light came through. "You already know," she said quietly, not as a question, as a reminder, because the hardest part wasn't understanding what had happened. It was accepting what it meant, and once she did, everything else became simpler. She started small, a drawer, just one, clothes folded neatly, placed into a suitcase without hesitation. No dramatic pauses, no second guessing, just movement. At one point, Emmett walked past the bedroom and slowed slightly when he saw the open suitcase on the bed. "You going somewhere?" he asked, his tone neutral. Adela didn't look up. "Yes." He stood there for a moment, waiting. When no explanation came, he nodded once. "All right." And then, he kept walking. The apartment felt different now, not empty, just quieter, more honest. Every item she touched carried a memory, not painful, not overwhelming, just distant. She paused briefly when she reached the shelf by the window. A small object sat there, A gift he had given her early on, simple, thoughtful. She picked it up, turning it in her hand. For a moment, she almost smiled. Then she placed it gently back where it was. Some things didn't need to be taken. There were moments where a conversation could have happened, moments where either of them could have said something, but they didn't, and somehow, that felt more honest than forcing words that wouldn't change anything. That evening, they found themselves in the same room again, not sitting together, not apart, just there. Emmett glanced at her, then at the suitcase by the door. "You've been busy," he said. Adela nodded slightly. "Yes." Another pause. "You're sure about this?" She met his eyes. "I am." He held her gaze for a second longer, then looked away. Okay, no argument, no attempt to stop her, and that told her everything she needed to know, nothing out of place, nothing broken. It almost felt like she was stepping out for the day, except she wasn't coming back. Adela stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the frame. She let her eyes move across the space slowly. The couch, the table, the quiet corners that once held something more. She didn't linger, didn't search for a reason to stay, because she had already found a reason to leave. There was no anger in her chest, no resentment pulling at her thoughts, just certainty. She had loved him, that part was real, and she didn't regret it. But love, she understood now, wasn't enough on its own. Not when it wasn't protected, not when it wasn't returned in the moments that mattered most. "You gave what you could," she said softly to herself, "and now you choose yourself." The words didn't feel forced, they felt true. Emmett was in the living room when she stepped out with her suitcase. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "You need help?" he asked. Adela shook her head. "No." A small pause, then she added, "I'll be fine." He nodded slowly. "I know." For a brief second it felt like something else might be said, something that could change things, but it didn't happen, and they both knew it wouldn't. Adela reached for the door, her hand steady, and just before she stepped out, she turned back, not with hesitation, not with doubt, just acknowledgement. "Take care, Emmett." His response came just as quietly. "You too, Adela." The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound, not loud, not dramatic, just finished. She didn't stop in the hallway, didn't look back, because she didn't need to. Everything that needed to be understood already was. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just new. Adela adjusted her grip on the suitcase and stepped forward, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving, and for the first time in a long time, there was no uncertainty in her steps. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she finally understood. Love shouldn't feel like something you have to hold together alone, and while she walked forward without looking back, the world behind her began to tell its own version of the story. It didn't take long. News like that never does. At first it was subtle, a mention here, a passing comment there. People who barely knew them suddenly had opinions. "Did you hear about Emmett and his wife?" I wonder what happened. The details didn't matter. Not really, because people were never interested in the truth, just a version that made sense to them. The story changed as it moved, each time becoming simpler, cleaner, easier to repeat. She couldn't give him a family. He needed something more stable. It just didn't work out. No one said it directly to her. They didn't need to. It existed in conversations she wasn't part of, but somehow always reached her anyway. Through a look, a pause, a sentence that trailed off when she entered the room. By the time the story settled, it wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone else. And in that version, Adela became something she didn't recognize, the woman who couldn't, the one who fell short, the one who was left behind. It was easier that way, easier than asking what really happened, easier than questioning someone like Emmett, because success has a way of protecting people, and silence has a way of rewriting everything. The first time she heard it directly, she didn't respond. She was standing in line at a small cafe waiting for her order. Two women stood behind her, voices low but not low enough. I heard she just disappeared, probably embarrassed. Adela's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. She must be having a hard time. A small pause. Then, after everything, what else could she do? Adela didn't turn around, didn't correct them, didn't say a word. When her name was called, she stepped forward, took her drink, and left. Because explaining herself wasn't something she needed to do anymore. It would have been easy to speak, to correct, to tell her side, but she didn't. Not because she didn't have one, but because she didn't need one. The people who mattered would understand. Were never going to. She sat by the window later that afternoon, watching people pass by without noticing her. For the first time in a long time, she felt removed from it all, not isolated, just separate. And there was something peaceful about that. To them, she was alone. To them, she had lost everything. To them, her story had already ended. But they weren't there. They didn't see the quiet strength it took to walk away without breaking. They didn't see the clarity that came after. They didn't see what she was building, because it wasn't loud. Adela looked down at her hands, resting calmly in her lap. Steady, certain. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Days turned into weeks, weeks into something softer, less defined. Life slowed in a way she hadn't expected. Mornings came without urgency. Evenings didn't feel rushed. She found herself noticing things she used to overlook. The way sunlight moved across the room, the quiet rhythm of her own thoughts, the absence of pressure. "You seem different," someone said to her once. Not accusing, just observing. Adela smiled slightly. "I am," and that was all she offered. There were small signs, not obvious, not something anyone else would notice, but she felt them. Moments where she didn't think about the past at all. Moments where she laughed, without forcing it. Moments where she felt like herself again. Not the version she had been before, not the version people assumed she became. Something else, something quieter, stronger, and somewhere within that shift, something new was beginning. The world had already decided her story. They had written the ending for her, closed the chapter, moved on. But Adela hadn't, because while they were busy deciding what she had lost, she was discovering what she still had, and more importantly, what she was capable of becoming. And in a place where no one expected anything from her, she met someone who didn't try to define her at all. The town wasn't impressive. That was the point. No rush of traffic, no constant noise, no need to be anything other than present. Adela didn't choose it because it was special. She chose it because it wasn't. A place where no one knew her name, no one asked questions, no one expected anything. The mornings were quieter here. She noticed that first. Not silence, just a softer kind of sound. Wind through trees, distant footsteps, a life that moved without pressure. It took her a while to get used to it, but once she did, she didn't want to go back. At first, she didn't try to rebuild anything. She didn't rush into new routines, didn't force herself into change. She simply existed. Some days were easier than others. Some felt longer than they should, but there was no weight attached to them, no expectation to feel a certain way. She gave herself space, and slowly, that space began to feel like something she needed. One morning, she stood outside with a cup of coffee, watching the sky shift from gray to light. She didn't check her phone, didn't think about what came next. She just stood there, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. She met him without meaning to. There was no setup, no introduction, just a moment that happened. Adela was reaching for a box on a high shelf in a small local store when it slipped slightly from her grip. Before it could fall, a hand steadied it. "Careful," a voice said, calm and unhurried. She glanced over. He wasn't trying to impress her, wasn't studying her. Just, "There, thank you," she said, adjusting the box. He gave a small nod. "No problem." And that could have been the end of it. But as she turned to leave, he added, "That shelf's been loose for weeks. I keep telling them to fix it." She paused, looking back at him. "Then maybe you should fix it." A slight smile. "Maybe I will." She saw him again a few days later. Same place, same quiet atmosphere. "The shelf?" she asked, glancing toward it. He looked up. "Fixed." She checked it, pressing lightly against the edge. "Looks stable." "It is." A small pause. Then, "Thanks for the suggestion." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't think you'd actually do it." He shrugged. Didn't seem like a big thing to ignore. That was the difference. He noticed things. Small things. And instead of talking about them, he did something. It wasn't long before their conversations became a little longer. Still simple, still easy, but more frequent. One afternoon she sat outside the store, a book resting open in her lap. "You don't turn the pages," he said, stepping out beside her. She glanced up. "I'm reading." He shook his head slightly. "You've been on the same page for 10 minutes. She blinked, then looked down. He wasn't wrong. "I guess I got distracted." He didn't press. didn't ask what she was thinking about, just nodded. Happens. And somehow, that was enough. They didn't exchange numbers right away, didn't rush into anything. They simply kept running into each other, and every time, it felt natural. "What are you reading this time?" he asked one day. Adela held up the book. "I'm actually reading this one." He smiled slightly. "Good." She studied him for a moment. "You always this observant?" "Only when it matters, and this matters." He met her gaze, calm and steady. "It does if you're sitting here every day." She looked away briefly, a faint smile forming. "That's fair." Giovanni never asked her about her past. Not directly, not in a way that made her feel like she had to explain anything. And that meant more than she expected. One evening they sat side by side, watching the sky fade into softer colors. Adela broke the silence. "I don't think I know who I am anymore." She didn't look at him when she said it. Didn't need to. He took a moment before answering. "I don't think you're supposed to." She turned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you get to figure it out again," he said, "without anyone telling you who you should be." A quiet pause settled between them. "And if I don't know where to start?" she asked. He shrugged lightly. "Then don't start anywhere." She frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "It does," he replied calmly. "You don't need to rush something that isn't broken." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then, for the first time, she let that idea settle. It didn't feel like falling into something new. It felt like returning to something steady. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. They started walking together in the evenings, not planned, just something that happened. "You're quiet tonight," he said once. Adela glanced at him. "I'm thinking about?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "This feels different." He didn't rush to respond, just nodded slightly. "It is," she studied him. "You're not going to ask what I mean by that?" "No. Why not?" "Because you'll tell me if you want it." She let out a small breath. Not frustration, relief. The change wasn't obvious at first, but it was there, in the way she carried herself, in the way she spoke, in the way she no longer felt the need to explain her silence. One afternoon, she caught a reflection in a window as she passed by. For a second, she stopped, not because she didn't recognize herself, but because she did. And that felt new. Giovanni stepped up beside her. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "Nothing." Then, after a brief pause, "Actually, it's not nothing." He waited. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." He nodded once. "Good." That was all he said. No praise, no overreaction, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. He didn't change her life. He didn't try to. He simply gave her the space to rebuild it on her own terms. And that made all the difference. But long before she met him, something no one else knew. It hadn't started as a big decision. There was no single moment where Adela sat down and declared what she was going to do. It came quietly, the way most important choices do. A thought that stayed longer than the others. A question that didn't fade. What if there's another way? She didn't bring it up right away, didn't rush to share it, because at the time, she still believed they were moving forward together, still believed there was space to figure things out. So instead, she began on her own. The first appointment she scheduled, she went to alone, not because she wanted to exclude Emmett, but because she didn't want to wait for him to be ready. The room was quiet, not cold, just careful, the kind of place where people speak gently, even when they're not saying anything difficult. "You still have options," the specialist told her, reviewing her chart. Adela listened closely. What kind of options? The answer wasn't immediate. It came with explanation, possibilities, paths that required patience, commitment, time. And as she sat there, absorbing it all, one thing became clear. She wasn't done hoping. She didn't make it public, didn't sit Emmett down for a long discussion. Not yet, because she could already feel the difference between them, the way he approached things, the way she did, one step at a time, more appointments, more questions, more understanding. Each visit brought her closer to something she couldn't fully explain, but deeply believed in. "You're certain you want to move forward?" the doctor asked gently. Adela nodded without hesitation. Yes, and for the first time in a while, she felt sure about something. The day she found out, there was no dramatic reaction. No tears, no disbelief, just stillness. She sat there, the words settling in slowly. "You're expecting—" The doctor's voice was steady, calm. Adela blinked once. Then again, as if giving herself time to understand what that meant. Not possibility, not hope, reality. And, "Everything looks good?" she asked. The doctor smiled slightly. "Yes." A pause, then, "There's more than one." Adela frowned slightly, not quite following. "I'm sorry?" The doctor turned the screen slightly toward her. "3. For a moment." She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't react. Then her hand came to rest lightly over her stomach. Not in shock, in recognition. It wasn't overwhelming. Not in the way people might expect. Adela didn't rush out to celebrate, didn't call anyone immediately. She walked outside instead, sat down, and let it settle. 3. The number repeated quietly in her mind. Not heavy, not frightening, just unexpected. A small breath escaped her lips. Then, a soft smile, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because something had changed, something real, something that belonged to her. By the time she returned home that evening, nothing had changed there. The apartment felt the same, the quiet, the distance, the space between conversations. Emmett was already home, sitting in the living room, focused on something in his hands. "You're back late," he said without looking up. "I had an appointment," she replied. He nodded. "Everything okay?" Adela paused, just for a second. Then, "Yes." He didn't ask anything else, didn't press, didn't look up. And in that moment, she understood something clearly. This wasn't something she could share with him. Not because he wouldn't hear it, but because he wouldn't hold it the way it needed to be held. She didn't decide immediately, not that night, not the next. She gave herself time, watched, waited, hoped something might shift, that maybe he would ask, notice, be present, but he didn't. And slowly, her decision became clearer, not out of anger, not out of hurt, but out of understanding. "I won't bring them into uncertainty," she said quietly, not to anyone else, just to herself, because this mattered too much. By the time she walked away from the marriage, she had already chosen her path. It was something she was preparing for. Giovanni didn't find out right away. She didn't lead with it, didn't make it the center of who she was. But when she told him, it wasn't dramatic. They were sitting outside, the evening settling in around them. "I need to tell you something," she said. He glanced at her. "Okay." She didn't hesitate. "I'm pregnant." A brief pause. Then, "It's triplets." Giovanni didn't react immediately. Not out of shock, but out of care, processing, understanding. Then he nodded once. Gaze. What else would there be? A small silence passed between them. Then he added, "We'll figure it out. Not you, not this. We." Giovanni didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Didn't make it complicated. Didn't treat it like something fragile. He adjusted, quietly, naturally. The next time she saw him, he carried an extra bag. "What's that?" she asked. "Things you'll probably need," he said simply. She raised a brow. "You've done this before?" He shook his head. "No." "Then how do you know what I need?" He gave a small shrug. "I don't—" A pause. "But I'll learn—" Adela looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Then, for the first time since she found out, she didn't feel like she was carrying it alone. The world thought her story ended when she left, but the truth was, that's where something new had already begun. Quietly, carefully, and completely on her terms. And now, 3 years later, she was walking back into the place where everyone thought they already knew her story. The drive was quiet. Not tense, not heavy, just focused. Adela rested her hand lightly against the window as the car slowed, her eyes following the long stretch of trees leading up to the estate. Nothing had changed. The same entrance, the same carefully maintained grounds. Everything still looked exactly the way it used to, polished, impressive, untouched by time. The car came to a stop. For a brief second, she didn't move, not out of hesitation, just acknowledgement. Then she opened the door and stepped out, and just like that, she was back. The air felt different now, not because the place had changed, but because she had. Before, it had felt like something to live up to. Now, It felt like something to observe. Guests moved through the space with quiet confidence, their conversations blending into a steady hum. Laughter, greetings, the soft clink of glasses. All familiar, all distant. Adela walked forward at an even pace, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. She didn't rush, didn't slow. She simply entered on her own terms. It started almost immediately. A glance, then another. Then the quiet shift in conversation that follows recognition. Is that... I thought... She actually came? The words didn't reach her directly, but she didn't need them to. The surprise, the quiet evaluation. Adela didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, because she had already expected it, and more importantly, it didn't affect her. She moved through the space without hesitation, her gaze steady, her movements unhurried. Someone passed by her, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Adela," they said. "Good to see you." She returned the smile, just as composed. "You too." No tension, no discomfort. Just a simple exchange that didn't invite anything more. And that was intentional. Because she wasn't there to explain herself. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there because she chose to be. She saw him before he saw her, standing near the center of the room, engaged in conversation, exactly where he would be, exactly how she remembered. Composed, confident, untouched. From a distance, nothing about him had changed. But when his gaze lifted and landed on her, something shifted, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But she saw it, the pause, the recognition, the adjustment. He excused himself from the conversation almost immediately and walked toward her, not rushed, not hesitant, measured. "Adela," he said as he reached her. His voice carried the same calm control it always had. "You came," she met his gaze without hesitation. "You invited me, not uncomfortable, just aware." Emmett nodded once. "I wasn't sure you would." Adela tilted her head slightly. "You seemed confident enough to send the invitation." The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "That doesn't mean I expected an answer." She held his gaze for a moment longer. "Then, well, now you have one." There was no tension in her voice, no challenge, just truth. And somehow, that made it more noticeable. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the room continuing around them, people moving, talking, observing without appearing to. But between them, there was stillness, not awkward, not emotional, just layered. Emmett glanced at her briefly, then back at her face. "You look well," he said. Adela nodded slightly. "I am." A short silence followed. Then she added, "You seem busy." He let out a quiet breath. "That hasn't changed." "No," she said softly. "It hasn't." And just like that, everything they didn't say settled between them. Someone approached Emmett, greeting him with familiarity. "Sorry to interrupt," they said, glancing briefly at Adela before turning back to him. Emmett nodded, acknowledging them. "I'll be right there." The person stepped away, but not without another glance. Adela noticed. Of course she did. She looked back at Emmett. "You should get back to your guests." His eyes stayed on her a moment longer than necessary. "I will." But he didn't move right away, as if something was holding him there. Or maybe, as if he wasn't sure what to say next, Adela gave him a small, polite nod. "I'll find my way." That seemed to settle it. "All right," he said, and then he stepped away. Adela continued through the space, her steps even, her expression unchanged. But the atmosphere around her had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough, because now everyone knew she was there, and more importantly, they were watching, waiting, curious to see how this would unfold. Adela paused briefly near the edge of the room, her gaze moving across the crowd, not searching, just observing, because she understood something they didn't. This wasn't a return, it wasn't a reunion, and it definitely wasn't what they expected. This, and soon, the questions would start. Not directly, but in the way people always ask them. It started with smiles, the kind that look welcoming, but paused just a second too long. "Adela, it's been a while," a woman said as she approached, her tone warm, her eyes curious. "It has," Adela replied, matching the tone without effort. "You look, well, thank you." A brief silence followed, not empty, just waiting. Then, "How have you been?" The question sounded simple, but it lingered. Adela tilted her head slightly. "Good," she said, and left it there. Another guest joined the conversation, their expression polite but observant. "Still living somewhere quiet, I hear?" Adela glanced at them. "Yes, that must be peaceful." The word sat there, stretched just enough to carry more than it should. "It is," she answered. A faint smile. "But I imagine it gets a little lonely." There it was, soft, careful, designed to sound harmless. Adela held their gaze. "Not really." The response was simple, unbothered, and that, more than anything, seemed to catch them off guard. The circle shifted slightly as more people gathered, curiosity pulling them in. "I always wondered what you decided to do after everything," someone said, their tone light, almost casual. Adela looked at them. "I kept living." A small pause, then a quiet laugh from someone nearby. "Well, I suppose that's one way to put it," another voice followed. "Do you travel much now?" "Sometimes." "That must be nice. No responsibilities tying you down." The words were smooth, but the meaning was clear. Adela didn't react, didn't correct them, just nodded once. "It has its advantages." The conversation didn't stop. It shifted, changed direction, but always found its way back. Different voices, same message. "So, no big changes? Still enjoying your independence?" "I imagine it's easier without all the pressure." Each question wrapped in politeness, each one circling the same idea, that her life had become smaller, simpler, less. Adela listened, answered when necessary, but never expanded, because she understood something they didn't. Not every truth needs to be shared. She didn't rush to respond, didn't fill the space. She let the silence do what it needed to do, and when she spoke, it was enough. "You seem very content," someone observed. Adela met their gaze. "I am—" A pause. Then, "That's good," but the tone suggested something else, something unspoken. And this didn't match. Across the room, Emmett watched, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but he saw it, the way the conversations formed, the way they lingered around her, the subtle shifts in tone, the questions that sounded harmless, but weren't. For a moment it looked like he might step in. Say something, interrupt, but he didn't. He stayed where he was, listening, observing, allowing it to continue. And Adela, she noticed, of course she did, it wasn't new. That was the part that settled in quietly. This moment, it wasn't different, it was familiar. The same kind of silence, the same lack of interruption, the same choice to let things unfold without stepping in. Adela shifted her weight slightly, her expression unchanged, because she had seen this before, felt this before, and more importantly, she had already decided what it meant. The conversation narrowed again. Fewer people now, more direct. One woman leaned in slightly, her voice lowered just enough to feel more personal. "I hope you don't mind me asking." Adela met her gaze. "I usually don't." A small smile. "Well, do you ever regret it?" The question lingered, not rushed, not softened, just placed carefully between them. Adela didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch just enough. Then, "No." The woman blinked slightly. "Not at all?" Adela's voice stayed calm. "Not at all." And something about the certainty in her tone shifted the atmosphere. For a moment no one spoke. The conversation paused, not because it was finished, but because it had reached a point no one expected. Adela didn't look uncomfortable, didn't look unsure. She looked at ease, and that wasn't the reaction they were waiting for. Across the room, Emmett's gaze returned to her. Longer this time, more focused, because something about her didn't match the version he thought he would see. Adela adjusted her posture slightly, her eyes moving across the room with quiet awareness. She could feel it now. The shift, the attention, the expectation building, because the room wasn't done with her yet, and neither was he. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that everything they thought they understood was about to change. And when it did, it wouldn't be because she explained anything. It would be because something else spoke first. The conversation hadn't fully recovered. It lingered in that quiet space where no one quite knew what to say next. And then, a voice, clear, small, certain. "Mom." It didn't echo. It didn't need to. Because the moment it was spoken, everything stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. Heads turned, conversations paused, attention shifted. Adela didn't react right away. Not because she hadn't heard, but because she knew exactly who it was. Her expression changed before she even turned. Subtle, but undeniable, the calm composure remained, but something warmer moved through it, something softer, real. She turned toward the voice, her eyes already finding them. And for the first time since she arrived, her guard wasn't there. "There you are," she said, her voice gentler than before. "I was wondering when you'd find me." She stepped forward without hesitation, lowering herself slightly as three small figures approached her. They moved together, close, connected, as if they had always done everything side by side. Adela knelt just enough to meet them at eye level. "You didn't get lost, did you?" she asked softly. One of them shook their head quickly. "No, we stayed together like you said." She smiled, brushing a hand lightly over their hair. "Good." There was no tension in her movements, no awareness of the room watching. Just presence, just care. They stood there beside her, three of them, similar enough to be unmistakable, different enough to be their own, bright eyes, steady posture, curious, but not overwhelmed. One of them glanced around the room. "There's a lot of people," they said quietly. Adela nodded. "There is." Another looked up at her. "Are we staying long?" She considered that for a moment. Not too long. And that answer carried more meaning than anyone else in the room could understand. At first no one spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. The shift wasn't loud, it was controlled confusion, eyes moving, expressions changing, whispers beginning then stopping. Did she just? Are those? I didn't know. The questions stayed unfinished, because no one had enough information to finish them. The energy in the room changed completely. Not tense, not chaotic, just focused. Every conversation that had been happening moments before faded, because now there was something else to look at, something else to understand. Adela stood, one hand resting lightly on the shoulder of one child, the others close beside her. She didn't explain, didn't introduce them, didn't acknowledge the attention, because she didn't need to. Across the room, Emmett hadn't moved, not since the moment he heard the word, "Mom." His expression didn't shift dramatically, but something behind it did, something that didn't settle right away. He took a step forward, then another, slow, measured. When he reached her, his gaze moved briefly to the children, then back to her. "Adela," he said, not questioning, not certain, just searching. She met his gaze calmly. "Yes?" He hesitated, not because he didn't know what to ask, but because he didn't know how to ask it. "Your children?" he said finally. Adela didn't rush to answer, didn't soften it, didn't prepare him. She simply nodded. "Yes." A small pause. Then, "I don't think you've met them." Her voice stayed even. No emphasis, no performance, just truth. For a second, nothing else existed. Not the room, not the people, just that moment, the space between what he thought he knew and what was standing in front of him now. One of the children looked up at him curiously. "Hi," they said, simple, unaware of everything else surrounding them. Emmett blinked once, then nodded slightly. "Hi." But his attention didn't stay there. It returned to Adela. Because now, he understood something he hadn't before. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to realize he had missed something, something significant, and there was no way to go back and find it again. The room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations returned, but softer now, more cautious, because everything had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to shift everything that came before. Adela rested her hand gently on one of the children's shoulders, her posture steady, her expression calm. She hadn't come to prove anything, hadn't come to explain herself, and yet, without saying more than a few words, she already had. But while the room tried to understand what they had just seen, Emmett was still trying to understand something else, something much harder to face. The room had found its rhythm again, but close enough for people to continue. Adela stood near the edge of the garden doors, the children beside her, their attention already drifting toward something lighter, something easier. "Can we go look outside?" one of them asked, pointing toward the open space beyond. She nodded gently. "Stay where I can see you." "We will." They moved off together, still close, still connected. Adela watched them for a second longer, then felt it, that presence again. She didn't turn right away, didn't need to, Can we talk? Emmett asked quietly. She faced him then. Of course. They stepped just far enough from the room for the noise to soften, not completely gone, but distant. Emmett didn't speak immediately. For once, he didn't seem prepared, didn't seem certain. I don't understand, he said finally. There was no edge in his voice, no accusation, just honesty. Adela nodded slightly. I figured. He glanced briefly toward where the children stood, then back at her. When did this... how... He stopped himself, not because he didn't want to ask, but because he didn't know where to begin. Adela didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't offer explanations before he asked. She simply stood there, steady, present. You can ask, she said. Her tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't guarded, it was open, but not inviting more than she was willing to give. Emmett exhaled slowly. They're yours. It wasn't really a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. Another pause. And you've been raising them? Yes. Her responses were simple, uncomplicated, and that made it harder for him to process. His gaze dropped briefly, then returned to her. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out quieter than he expected. Not sharp, not demanding, just late. Adela looked at him, her expression unchanged. You didn't ask. The words weren't meant to hurt. But they landed. Emmett blinked once. That's not... He stopped. Because it was. She didn't explain everything, didn't walk him through every moment. She gave him only what mattered. I found out before I left, she said. His expression shifted slightly. Before? She nodded. I had already started looking into other options. A small pause. When things became uncertain. I didn't stop. Emmett's jaw tightened slightly. You could have told me. Adela held his gaze. I could have... Another pause. But I knew what your answer would have been. He looked at her then. Really looked. As if trying to find something he had missed. Something that would make this easier to understand. Why didn't you give me the chance? He asked. Her answer came without hesitation. Because when it mattered, she paused just long enough for the words to settle. You stopped listening. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just full. Emmett didn't respond right away. He couldn't, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct. The truth didn't need to be repeated. It was already there. He looked away briefly, his hand brushing against the back of his neck, a small unconscious movement, then back at her. I thought, he started, but the sentence didn't finish, because whatever he thought didn't matter now. I thought I needed everything to be certain, he said finally, his voice quieter now, more honest than it had been all day. I thought if something wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't worth holding on to. Adela listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just hearing him. He let out a small breath. I didn't realize what I was letting go of. She studied him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, just understanding. You weren't letting go, she said softly. You were stepping away. Another silence settled between them, this one different. Less heavy, more final. Emmett glanced once more toward the children. They seem happy. Adela followed his gaze. They are... A brief pause. Then he nodded. That's good. She looked back at him. It is... There was nothing else to say. No need to revisit the past. No need to question what couldn't be changed. Because everything that mattered was already clear. Adela turned slightly, her attention returning to the children. Not as an escape, but as a choice. And Emmett stood there for a moment longer. Not trying to stop her, not asking for more. Because for the first time, he understood something fully, not what he had lost, but when he lost it. Emmett didn't hear him approach. There was no interruption, no need for one. Just a presence that fit into the moment without forcing it. Hey, Giovanni said softly as he stepped beside Adela. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough to be noticed. Adela turned slightly, her expression shifting, not dramatically, just enough. You found us, she said. He nodded, glancing briefly toward the children. They were asking about the garden. One of them looked back, smiling. There's a path. Giovanni smiled faintly. I saw. Then his attention returned to Adela. You okay? She met his gaze, steady and calm. I am. Giovanni's eyes moved briefly to Emmett. Not assessing, not challenging, just acknowledging. Hey, he said simply. Emmett nodded in return. Hi. There was no pause that demanded explanation, no shift in posture, no need to establish anything, because nothing needed to be proven, and that was the difference. One of the children stepped closer, lightly tugging at Giovanni's sleeve. Can we go now? They asked, their voice filled with quiet excitement. Giovanni glanced down. Give me a second, he said gently. Another child joined, looking up at him. You said there might be flowers. There are, he replied. But we don't run off without saying anything first, remember? They nodded in unison. Okay. He rested a hand briefly on one of their shoulders. Not firm, not controlling, just present. The smallest of the three looked between Adela and Giovanni, then back at him. Dad, they said softly, can we go together? The words settled into the space quietly, not loud, not emphasized, just natural. Didn't pause, didn't correct it. Yeah, he said, his tone easy. We'll go together. Adela watched the moment without interrupting, not surprised, not uncertain, just certain. Emmett stood still, not frozen, just still. His gaze moved from the children to Giovanni, then to Adela. He didn't speak, didn't question it, because there was nothing unclear about what he had just heard. There was nothing he could say that would change it. Giovanni didn't try to step forward, didn't position himself, didn't make his presence larger than it needed to be. He simply stood where he belonged, beside her, within their space, part of something that had already been built. And Adela, she didn't hesitate, didn't shift, didn't look for reassurance, because she didn't need to. This wasn't something new. It was something steady, something tested, something chosen every day. Stay close, she said gently to the children. We will, they replied. Giovanni gave a small nod. I'll take them around and come back. She glanced at him. Okay, no long explanation, no instructions, just understanding. The children moved ahead, Giovanni following just behind them, his pace easy, his attention steady. Adela watched them for a moment, not checking, not worrying, just seeing, and then she turned back. For a brief second neither of them spoke. Emmett's gaze lingered where Giovanni and the children had disappeared, then returned to her. That's, he started, but didn't finish, because there wasn't a word that fit. Adela waited, not expecting anything, not needing anything. He exhaled quietly. You built something? She nodded. I did. Another pause. Then he added, It's solid. Her expression softened slightly. It is. There was no comparison in her tone, no suggestion of what had been before, just truth. Emmett looked at her one last time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and for the first time, he understood what had replaced what he thought he had lost. Not something louder, not something more impressive, something steadier, something real. Adela gave him a small, polite nod, then turned, her attention already shifting back toward the path where the children had gone, because that was where she belonged now, not in the past, not in what could have been, but in what was already built, and still growing. She hadn't come back to show him anything, but somehow he had seen everything he needed to. And before she left, there was only one thing left to say. Adela didn't rush to leave. She didn't need to. The moment had already settled into place, but she knew when it was time. She found Emmett again near the edge of the room, where the noise didn't press in as much. He noticed her before she spoke. Leaving? He asked. She nodded. Yes, not uncomfortable, just understood. I'm glad you came, he said, and this time it sounded honest. Adela studied him for a moment, not searching, not questioning, just present. I'm glad I did too, she replied, and she meant it, not because of him, not because of the room, but because there was no longer anything uncertain about any of it. Everything that needed to be clear was. They stood there for a second longer, no pressure to continue, no need to revisit anything, because the past had already said everything it was going to say. Emmett gave a slight nod. Take care of yourself. Adela's expression softened, just slightly. You too, No hesitation, no second-guessing, just a quiet exchange between two people who no longer needed anything from each other. As she turned to leave, Emmett didn't follow, didn't call her back, didn't try to extend the moment. He simply stood there, watching, not the way he had before, not measuring, not evaluating, just seeing. And for the first time, he understood something without needing it explained, not what she had become, but what she had always been, and what he had chosen not to hold on to. She paused just before stepping fully away, turning back slightly. "I hope you find what you were looking for," she said. Her voice wasn't heavy, wasn't layered with anything hidden, just sincere. Emmett met her gaze, but he didn't, because he knew, whatever he had been looking for, he had misunderstood it. Adela didn't linger after that. She walked toward the exit with the same steady pace she had arrived with, not fast, not slow, just certain. Outside, the air felt open, unrestricted. She spotted them near the path, Giovanni and the children, exactly where she expected them to be. "Ready?" she asked as she approached. One of the children looked up. "Yeah, there's a whole garden back there," another added. "And a bench." Giovanni glanced at her. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Everything's clear." He studied her for a second, then nodded once. "Good." They walked together toward the car, not in perfect formation, not in a straight line, just naturally. One child slightly ahead, another beside her, the third reaching back toward Giovanni, who adjusted his pace without thinking. "Can we come back here again?" one of them asked. Adela smiled faintly. "We'll see." Giovanni glanced at her. "That's not a yes." "It's not a no either," she replied. He smiled slightly. "That's fair." And just like that, the moment moved forward, not held in place, not replayed, just continued. People will always try to define your story. They'll take one moment and turn it into everything. They'll decide what your life means based on what they see or what they think they understand. And sometimes they'll be wrong, not because they meant to be, but because they never stayed long enough to see what came next. Adela didn't correct them. She didn't explain. She didn't go back to prove anything. She simply kept going and built something they couldn't see coming. So if you've ever felt like your story was misunderstood or decided for you before you had the chance to live it, remember this: you don't have to explain it. You don't have to defend it. You just have to keep building it. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, what would you have done in her place?